So I have a series of videos that I want to show you under the title of evidence of what things that I've extracted from assorted videos to present to you to say, here's what we know. And so I want to start with the doctors at Parkland Hospital.
The doctors at Parkland Hospital, who tended the president minutes after the assassination, also saw a head wound compatible with a shot from the front.
I could see that he had a large, about 7-centimeter opening in the right occipital parietal area. A considerable portion of the brain was missing there, and the occipital cortex, the back portion of the brain, was lying down near the opening of the wound, and blood was trickling out.
Almost a fifth or perhaps even a quarter of the right back part of the head in this area here had been blasted out, along with probably most of the brain tissue in that area.
The president's body was flown in Air Force One directly from Dallas to Washington. Accompanied by Jackie Kennedy, the ornamental bronze casket was unloaded at Andrews Air Force Base, apparently to be driven straight to the Naval Medical Center at Bethesda for the official autopsy. It was here that Commanders Humes and Boswell, with Colonel Fink, were making their preparations for the autopsy of the century. Assisting them was medical technician Paul O'Connor.
The morgue door burst open and 6 or 7 men came carrying this casket in and set it on the floor next to the table, autopsy table. As I remember, this casket was a type of casket that was a cheap shipping type of casket. What I mean by a shipping casket is that it's not a very ornamental casket. It's not very expensive. It's a very plain casket.
This is not the casket in which Al Reich placed the president's body at Parkland Hospital, Dallas.
It was a expensive bronze-colored type. It was a bronze casket. One of the most expensive that we had in stock. It was a white satin lining inside the casket. We wrapped him in one of the sheets and just placed him in the casket that way.
The casket was opened, and inside was a slate gray rubber body bag with a zipper that ran from the head all the way down to the toes. It's the kind of body bag that you find people that were carried out of a disaster in. We unzipped the body bag, and inside was the body of the president. We put the body on the table. He was nude, no clothes on, but he had a white sheet, bloody white sheet wrapped around his face and his head.
So between Parkland Hospital in Dallas and the autopsy in Washington, the president's body had mysteriously been placed in another casket and also wrapped differently. Since the autopsy, there's also been a major discrepancy in the description of the president's fatal head wound.
It would be a jagged wound that involved the half of the right side of the back of the head. My initial impression was that it probably was an exit wound, so it was a very large wound.
This is not what the official autopsy photographs show. Hidden away for a quarter of a century and shown here for the first time, they reveal the back of the head intact.
The autopsy photographs show a massive wound, but it's in the right temporal area and into the parietal area, which is behind it, between the two. It is inconceivable to me that every single one of the witnesses who saw the president's head could be wrong, and specifically wrong, about this particular wound. They describe an avulsed, exploded open wound in the rear of the head. In the autopsy photographs, you see a small, neat wound of entrance. It's obvious to me that those photographs have been faked.
When I first saw the pictures of the president's body, so-called wounds, What really struck me was especially the head wound. They showed a nice little neat round bullet hole in the back of his head. Well, actually what I saw was the whole side of his head blown off. It was gone. I don't know where those things came from, but they're totally wrong. Every one of them.
In 1964, the Warren Commission dealt with this evidence by not looking at it. It was made available to them. They felt if they looked at it, they would have to deal with it and publish it. So they didn't deal with it. In 1977, around that time frame, the House Assassinations Committee had the photographs. What they did with it was even less excusable. They had the photographs, they had the questions that were brought to them about the photographs, and they did not allow the Dallas doctors, the most important witnesses in this particular area of the evidence, to even view them. And the reason seems quite clear. If they have the best eyewitnesses looking at the photographs saying that's not the condition of the president's head, then you not only have a conspiracy to kill the president, but absolute proof of the conspiracy to cover it up after the fact, because the only people who had the photographs were the government. If somebody faked those photographs, it was someone within the government, someone who had access to those photographs.
So we have a discrepancy between the emergency room doctors and the autopsy and autopsy photographs. I need to get another, it'll take a little while here as I have to load and unload DVDs. These are things that aren't available online, so we have to work with the disc. But I wanted you to get these segments.
In front of hundreds of witnesses, a president is murdered, an act of horrific violence.
Sal, we're not able to see it.
Right, I want to get it up and then.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to jump the gun.
No, you're okay. That's good. It's easy to forget. Okay, here we go.
Returning to Washington, again, the subject of an autopsy is raised.
In a bullet murder, there is no area of evidence more important than the autopsy. You can infer the trajectory of the bullets. So the autopsy in the Kennedy assassination is absolutely critical.
But the autopsy decision is made by the wrong people for the wrong reasons.
The whole Kennedy entourage does not understand the distinction between just an autopsy and a forensic autopsy. Kennedy was a Navy man, so the autopsy is going to be done at Bethesda Naval Hospital. A couple of ordinary hospital pathologists are assigned to do the autopsy.
Meanwhile, nobody asks whether James Humes and J. Thornton Boswell, the two hospital pathologists, are in any way qualified to do this autopsy. They weren't.
These people were not forensic pathologists. They knew they weren't forensic pathologists, but they were military people. They were ordered to do the autopsy, so they had to do it.
Friday evening, Kennedy's autopsy begins. They start with x-rays, which reveal bullet fragments in the brain. It's also clear that Kennedy had a tracheotomy in the ER to insert a breathing tube. But the pathologists don't realize there's a wound there as well.
They did not know that the tracheostomy, which they saw, had obscured a wound in the throat.
Then they find a bullet hole in his back, which quickly becomes a problem.
They had what was clearly an entrance wound in the back, and they couldn't account for the bullet.
The doctors are in a quandary because they got a bullet hole in Kennedy's back. They do total body x-rays, there's no bullet in the body.
So if a bullet hit Kennedy in the back, where did it go?
But the doctors aren't shown crucial evidence that would reveal where the bullet went.
The clothing had been taken away by the police. Well, examination of the clothing is part of the autopsy. It's very important to know.
Kennedy's shirt collar and tie show a bullet exited his throat, but doctors don't know that. Then they learn a bullet has been found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. So doctors assume it worked its way out of the body during cardiac massage. With that, they conclude the autopsy and the body is taken to lie in state. Now the doctors must write their report without access to the body, x-rays, or photos.
This is crazy. I mean, these guys saw the wound. Why can't they see the photos? And they saw the x-rays only once.
After speaking with the Dallas ER doctors, they conclude Kennedy was hit by 2 shots fired from behind and above. One went through his neck, the other shattered his skull.
So the bottom line is Kennedy did not have the kind of autopsy he should have had.
Because proper measurements and documentation were not done, the Kennedy autopsy will fuel controversy and debate for decades. But there is an
Okay, so let's look at what other forensics people have to say about this.
Beverly Oliver, the former nightclub singer at the Colony Club, be apparent at a normal autopsy. As doctors.
Okay.
Cyril Wecht explains.
A frangible bullet is one that is constructed to literally break apart upon impact. Some people call it an exploding missile, some people call it a dum-dum, but they're not quite the same. I think the more correct technical word would be a frangible bullet. If a frangible bullet had been fired from the right side, then it would have, of course, dispersed into dozens, if not hundreds, of fragments, leaving no significant piece of itself intact. There were many small pieces of metal that were never subjected to neutron activation analysis testing. And unless that was done, you see, we could never know for sure whether all of the fragments came from one particular bullet or one batch of bullets. That's the significance of the brain examination relating to whether there was a second gunman and also the possibility of whether a frangible bullet had been used by that second gunman firing from the right side.
I've become convinced that Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination and that he was very carefully chosen and very carefully set up to take the blame. Based upon what I've learned, it seems to me that all the principals involved in the plot to kill the president had ties of one kind or another with U.S. intelligence agencies. There was Trafficante and Giancana, who had been conspiring with the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro. Antoine Guérini, who had had a relationship with both the OSS and the CIA dating from 1943. And there was Oswald, whom I'm satisfied had been used as a low-level intelligence operative. So even though I don't think that the CIA, for example, had anything directly to do with the assassination, on the day after the assassination, they found themselves in a horribly compromised position, a position in which they could very easily have been blackmailed by the plotters into covering up whatever they knew about the assassination.
But the Mafia could hardly have acted alone, given the intricacy of the assassination plot and the strength of the cover-up for 25 years. Colonel Fletcher Prouty was Chief of Special Operations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Kennedy's presidency. He believes even more powerful forces were ultimately responsible.
I think without any question, it's what we called the use of hired gunmen. And this isn't new. In fact, this little manual here, which is called the Assassination Manual for Latin America, contains a line which says that, talking about Latin America, if possible, professional criminals will be hired to carry out specific selective jobs, jobs in quote, which means murders. Well, if this manual for Latin America, printed within the last few years, and a government manual, says that, there's no question but what the application of the same techniques was dated back in Kennedy's time. In fact, I know that from my own experience. You know, I was in that business in those days. So with that knowledge, you begin to realize that hired criminals, the way this book says, can be hired by anybody in power with sufficient money to pay them, but more importantly, with sufficient power to operate the cover-up ever after. Because you see, there's one thing to kill somebody. It's another thing to cover up the fact that you did it or that you hired somebody to do it, and that's more difficult. So they use the device of the Warren Commission report to cover up their hired killers. Now, who would hire the killers, and who has the power to put the Warren Commission report out over the top of the whole story? You see, you're dealing with a very high echelon of power. It doesn't necessarily reside in any government. It doesn't necessarily reside in any single corporate institution, but it seems to reside in a blend of the two. Otherwise, how could you have gotten people like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to participate in the cover-up, the police in Dallas to participate in the cover-up, etc., and the media? You know, all the media, not just one or two newspapers, but none of them will print the story that other than Oswald killed the president with 3 bullets, something that's absolutely untrue.
I think it's extremely important for the American people to know that there can be the overthrow of a government, that there can be a coup d'etat in America, that in fact did happen through the assassination of President Kennedy. In order to prevent that kind of thing from happening again, in order to expose the forces that were responsible for that kind of murder and the kind of cover-up that has ensued in the following 25 years, it's necessary to expose it. Otherwise, we can have the same thing repeated again. Therefore, in the same fashion that we have exposed problems and scandals involved with Watergate, problems in Vietnam, problems in Central America, problems in the overthrow of governments elsewhere like Allende in Chile, and on and on and on, so must we expose that same kind of political assassination in our country. As painful as it may be, as disruptive as it might be in a transitory nature, as embarrassing as it might be to certain individuals and organizations in the United States government, that has to be uncovered. If they were able to do it to John F. Kennedy then, they could do it to some other president in the future.
Backfire or a firecracker.
Seconds away in Udi Plaza.
So we first get to hear from the doctors at Parkland as to what they're dealing with, and they're emergency room doctors. It's not the first time they've dealt with a gunshot, and we hear what they have to say. Then we have an autopsy, and it's an autopsy by people who are not qualified to do it. Again, as I said, we don't have a real investigation of the Kennedy assassination, so it's hard to draw conclusions. But the fact that we have all of these anomalies lends itself to suspicions of a much more sophisticated conspiracy. Now, let's hear from some of the people who were witnesses at Dealey Plaza.
When I first heard a noise, I was not aware that that was a shot being fired. And maybe perhaps that's why I continued to film, because I thought it was a backfire or a firecracker. I mean, I wasn't used to being around guns. I did not realize that those were shots until I saw in the frame of my camera President Kennedy's head come off, the back of his head. Then I realized that that was a shot. I don't know how many I heard. I know where I thought the shots came from. Was the picket fence area, around that large tree, somewhere on the other side of those steps, but in the picket fence area. There was a figure there, and there was smoke there. I will always believe that the man that shot President Kennedy was standing somewhere in the picket fence area, and no one will ever convince me any differently.
Next to Beverly, as she filmed, was eyewitness Charles Brem with his young son. He was swiftly besieged by newsmen.
Tell us exactly what you saw, sir. He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man... That's all right, sir. You go ahead and tell it.
It was frightening. They took me and my 5-year-old boy because we were surrounded by the 2 busloads of people there. They had asked me, how do you know it was rifle shots? Were you ever in the Army? Were you ever? I said, yes, I was not only in the Army, I was in combat, and I pulled up my sleeve and showed them my arm and said that I've had bullet holes in me. So this started the crowd around me. Well, some of the police thought that I was possibly the guilty party, and they took me right to the front door of the school book depository where a police car was parked and put me and little Joe in the police car. Well, an awful lot of the people who were passing by there thought that I had did it, and I was pounding on the car and calling me names that you don't repeat in good company. And there were an awful lot of you didn't know the cops from the robbers.
After the assassination, Beverly was contacted at work by FBI agents who took her undeveloped film and promised to return it within 10 days. She has not seen it since.
From the position that I was filming, I had the best shot of the assassination, and probably the only one that had a real good shot of the grassy knoll. And probably would be a lot of unanswered questions answered if my film could be found.
Fortunately, a few feet to Beverly's left, Mary Ann Moorman in the dark coat took her picture a split second after the president had been fatally struck in the head. Although frequently examined by the FBI, her historic snapshot was too widely publicized to disappear.
We know that the president's car was in the center.
Its dramatic secret, however, has only recently been uncovered. After 5 years of intensive study of the Moorman picture by 2 researchers in Texas, Jack White and Gary Mack, there is at last convincing evidence of a gunman up on the grassy knoll.
Is the guy that we call Badge Man, and it appears to me that from our study of it, his waist is right at the top of the wooden fence.
Gary Mack was the first to isolate the image, now known as Badge Man.
What I was looking at, to a lot of people, might have just been like looking at an ink blot or something. And all of a sudden, I started to see eyes and ears and forehead and hair. And little by little, the pieces of this image started to make sense to me. And that's when I first called Jack. And with his photographic work doing the blow-ups, we could see more and more and more detail. And at one point, we realized that this fellow was probably wearing a police uniform or some type of uniform that was close enough to what the Dallas police were wearing so that he could pass as a police officer. And really, to me, that was the one scary moment, because that was such a brilliant plan. A police officer in that location, away from where people were watching, if anyone did see him, they wouldn't think anything about it, because there were police in that area, although nowhere near where we see this guy. So this guy was an imposter. And I got chills then, because that was the realization that this was a very cleverly, well thought out plan.
You have to keep in mind that the Mary Moorman picture is about this size, and the area that we're dealing with is about a 1/4 inch square. So the area that Badge Man appears in is very tiny. And that's why the attempts to enhance it photographically have been very difficult over the years.
This small area was the scene of an extraordinary encounter. Behind the picket fence, there is a car park, and in 1963, Gordon Arnold was a 22-year-old serviceman, just out of training camp and en route to a posting in Alaska. This is his first film interview.
On that particular morning, what happened was I came downtown and I thought there was going to be a parade. So what I did was I parked my vehicle back here in this parking lot, and I intentionally walked to this particular corner because I wanted to take pictures of the parade off of the railroad bridge. Well, this is about as far as I got, because what happened is when I got my leg to about this position, a man came around the corner off the bridge, had a suit on, and he turned around and he told me that I wasn't going to be there. And I guess I was younger and more spunky at that time, because I told him, you and who else is going to keep me off the bridge? And he pulled out an identification card and he said, I'm with the CIA. And I said, well, that's enough muscle. I'll leave. So I turned around and I brought my leg back over like this. I walked down the fence line here about halfway. And I was looking over the fence to see if I could get a good shot of the parade. And he come back up and he told me, he says, I told you to get out of this area. And I said, okay. So I walked the complete length of the fence, got around on the other side.
That's when I started to line up my frame so that I could take the picture of the parade. I had been panning shots through here so that I could get whatever was going to come down the street. And I saw that it was the President of the United States. And as I was panning down this direction, just as I got to about this position, a shot come right past my left ear. And that meant it would have had to have come from this direction. And that's when I fell down. And to me, it seemed like a second shot was at least fired over my head. There's a bunch of report going on in this particular area at that time. And what happened was that while I was laying on the ground, it seemed like a gentleman came from this particular direction. And I thought it was a police officer because he had a uniform of a police officer. But he didn't wear a hat, and he had dirty hands. But it didn't really matter much at that time because with him crying like he was, and with him shaking when he had the weapon in his hand, I think I'd have gave him almost anything except the camera because that was my mother's. And literally what the man did was kick me and asked me if I was taking a picture. I told him that I was. And when I looked at the weapon, it was about that big around, and I decided I'd let him go ahead and have the film. I gave it to him, and then he went back off in this direction. I went off in this direction. And 3 days later, I was in Alaska. And I didn't come back to the United States for about 18 months.
Take this one down.
Harrison.
So stayed there, in fact, until
Okay, let's see what Jim Garrison has to say about this.
a priest arrived to administer.
Story and the story and the
gunshot
where they heard the
gunshot wound in the brain of a bullet right through the head.
John Kennedy was obviously shot from the front. Everybody knows it. Virtually everybody in Dealey Plaza rushed to the grassy knoll where they heard the sounds.
It came from a fence between the book depository and the railroad track.
From behind the overpass over there, triple overpass.
Right over about 20 or 30 feet from the other end of that little picket fence.
And it sounded like it came from the left and in front of us, towards the wooden fence. And there was a puff of smoke that came underneath the trees.
We all four seen about the same thing as the shots. The smoke came from behind the hedge.
And then as the car got directly in front of us, well, a gunshot apparently from behind us hit the president side of the temple.
Do you think the first gunshot came from behind you too?
I think it came from the same location. Apparently back up on the mall.
When I stated I felt like the second and third shots could not have been fired from the same rifle, they reminded me that I wasn't an expert.
There was, 3 or 4 real close together, and it was, must have been the first one that shot him, because that was the time I took the picture. And during that time, after I took the picture and the shots were still being fired, I decided I'd better get on the ground. I was no more than 15 foot from the car and in line of fire, evidently.
Just as Mary started to take the picture and the president came right even with us, 2 shots, we looked at him and he was looking at a dog in the middle of the seat. 2 shots rang out and he grabbed his chest and a look of pain on his face and fell across toward Jackie. And she fell over on him and said, "My God, he's shot." And there was an interval, and then 3 or 4 more shots rang out. By that time, the motorcade had sped away.
In the vicinity of the 2 men, there was a flash of light, there was something which occurred which caught my eye in this immediate area on the embankment.
Ed Hoffman, a deaf mute standing by the next overpass, had a clear view behind the picket fence.
A cigarette. He was smoking a cigarette. And then a little bit later, he saw more smoke, and he saw the man turn around, and he had a gun in his hand, or a rifle. Saw him turn. He turned towards the area where he was standing, and he saw him run and throw the gun to a man that was wearing a railroad uniform. And the man took the gun apart and put it in a bag behind the railroad controls, the box there. And then he was frightened. He knew something was going on. And he started waving for a police officer. He saw a security guard or a Secret Service. He wasn't sure what he was, but he was trying to get his attention and tell him what he had saw. And the man turned his gun towards him, and it frightened my father, so he left.
Other witnesses heard shots from the rear. Photographs taken immediately after the killing showed a plainclothesman picking up a bullet. Others showed a ricochet off the sidewalk, fired away from the direction of the book depository. James Tague, standing by the triple underpass in front of the limousine facing the depository, was hit by flying lead or concrete. A bullet hole was found in the dashboard of the presidential limousine. There was a nick in the windshield. Motorcycle officer Billy Hargis, riding to the left rear of the presidential limousine, had been splattered with the president's blood and brain tissue. Another photograph caught Jack Ruby at the scene of the assassination. There were over 20 arrests immediately after the assassination. Only 3 were recorded.
Eugene Hale Brading, the high-level courier for the Mafia, who was arrested at the scene under the name of Jim Braden and interviewed by the FBI, then turned loose.
Attention all squad. Attention all squad. The suspect in the shooting at Elm in Houston is reported to be an unknown white male, approximately 30.
At 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes after the president was shot, police broadcast a description of the suspect based on a tip.
I report that an officer has been involved in a shooting in the 400 block of East 10th.
At 1:15, Dallas patrolman J.D. Tippett was shot near the corner of 10th and Patton. Shortly after 1, police received a call that a young man answering the description of Officer Tippett's killer, unknown white male, 30s, had slipped into the Texas Theater without buying a ticket.
That's the only report that the police got before they sent 15 cars to surround the Texas Theater. And even though the Dallas police have an admirable concern for the protection of property, they usually would have held back a few police cars in reserve, even for a type of criminal who would go into the theater without a ticket.
Also,
okay, so let me get to this here. I'll share that screen. Share. Isn't that doing it? There we go, and get to this. Do that. Just stop that. Okay, so as Jim Garrison says, the police respond to the theater because the guy enters without a ticket. Of course, he does loosely fit the description that has been put out about the person who killed Officer Tippett. So, you know, they're responding to the theater is not so so bad, but it's still, they've got a murder of a president and all of that. You think they may have more to go on. Anyway, so we have these witnesses who dispute the findings of the Warren Commission. We have anomalies with the autopsy. We have many items that cause questions about what exactly happened here. And let me just get up to this. So again, I don't have evidence that says here's what actually happened and this can be proven and it's been thoroughly investigated and vetted. But there are these issues that need to be reconciled, I feel. So let me just run through the things that we've talked about so far. Killing Kennedy at the only spot on the motorcade that was suitable for an ambush. An entry bullet wound in his throat. So he's shot from the front. We have another bullet wound to the right side of his head that clearly jerks his head back. The idea that he's shot from behind just doesn't jive with that evidence. There can be a shot that he gets hit with from behind, but it's not the throat and it's not the side of the head. We have evidence that quickly appears, so police are led to a conclusion, such as the receipt that Oswald has of the weapon that is alleged to have been the murder weapon. We have the murder of a Dallas police officer for no apparent reason that seems to suggest a distraction for the police operations and investigation after the murder. We have the paraffin test that returned negative, suggesting that Oswald did not fire a weapon. We have no fingerprints on the alleged weapon, only a palm print that appears after Oswald is killed and after the police visit the funeral home before Oswald is buried. We have a photo of Oswald holding the alleged weapon. It just seems this is a convenient piece of evidence that, why was he taking a picture of himself in his backyard holding the weapon? Unless somebody, wanted him to have that picture so it could be found. We have a pristine bullet found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital that allegedly killed Kennedy and also went through Connolly. We have an anonymous tip that's received 15 minutes after the shooting, providing a description of Oswald. Oswald's route to the Texas theater involves an inexplicable detour, so he can shoot police officer Tippett. We have no legitimate autopsy. We have no ballistics connecting the bullets with the weapons, nor do we have ballistics connecting the bullet and the weapons with the shooter. We have eyewitnesses who are disputing events at the crime scene. Medical staff disputing the botched autopsy. Emergency room doctors disputing the botched autopsy reports. We have Oswald's work as a squared away Marine at an air base for top secret missions. We have some evidence of his involvement with intelligence operations in Japan. We have Oswald's defection to Russia, claiming he will divulge top secret information, only to return years later to the US without facing criminal accountability, even though a U-2 plane had been shot down after he defected, which would suggest he did give information. Then we have Oswald's attempt to renounce his citizenship. and his failure to return days later to complete the task. All of this causes a sense that the story we're told by the Warren Commission simply doesn't hold up. That's my theory. And next week, we are going to learn about Jack Ruby. Okay, Lauren, with that, we can open up for discussion, comments.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, everybody can, when it's their turn to talk, they can, unmute themselves. You can turn on your video again and go to gallery view, so we can all feel like we're in class together. And you can use the raise the hand function, or you can try raising your hand, but we don't always see that. The raise the hand function works better. Okay, we'll start right off with Eileen here.
So where do they say they got the receipt for the gun? I mean, had they gone to his house? I mean, how would they got there in 15 minutes or 2 minutes? Crazy to me. Where do they get that?
Yeah, well, apparently
it's a setup, obviously.
Apparently Oswald carried it around with him and showed it off to friends. No, I'm joking. I don't have the details of it, but I believe they retrieved it from the boarding house. How quickly they got to the boarding house to search it after they made the arrest is, I don't know, but I suspect they executed a search there quickly after he was arrested at the theater. And that's where they retrieved the receipt. Allegedly.
Yes, allegedly. And I just want to say one other thing. Secret Service usually does a pretty good job. That day, they failed completely. That's all I have to say.
Maybe on purpose.
Yeah, I might take issue to say that they do a pretty good job, but that's okay.
Hey, Sal, I have a question. Why, even many, many years later, before her death, do you think that Jackie Kennedy never refuted the findings of the report, even though it was obviously at such odds with what she saw that day? She was right there and saw the destruction to him.
My guess, and that's all it is my guess, is that she really wanted to protect her children and wanted to get out of the limelight and get out of the fray. And it was, she wanted to be quiet about it. She didn't want to make, she never made any public comments to say this needs to be investigated. They need to get the people who killed my husband. She never did any of that. And I suspect it part of her personality, her persona, but also to try to take not shine a light more on her children. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, let's see. Graham or Jennifer?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the Jackie piece on that. It wouldn't surprise me a little bit at all that the Kennedy family itself pressured her not to be involved or say anything contradictory because of all their dealings that would be uncovered with the Mafia, etc. So they were very powerful at the time and could really kind of control what she did or didn't do. That wouldn't surprise me. I don't know how you'd investigate that, though.
Yeah, no, I think as I understand, and it's been written about, is that Bobby Kennedy did not want a broader investigation because it would unravel the relationship between the Kennedy administration and the mob, and that is in putting together plots to kill Castro, but also to the relationship between the Kennedys and the mob that related to Jack's extramarital stuff. And so they even though you would think that they would have an impetus to want to have a thorough investigation and the killers held accountable, there's too much dirty laundry that they're afraid will be exposed.
And that they maybe knew who the killers were anyway.
At least had strong suspicion. I would think that I would have to think that Bobby Kennedy knew that Carlos Marcello wanted revenge. And because Bobby was on he was the counsel to the Senate committee that was investigating the mob and was responsible for Carlos being deported. So he had to have suspicions about that. And as Attorney General, he could have pushed for a more thorough investigation, but he didn't. And the only reason I can surmise is that he would fear an investigation would reveal things about himself and his family.
Right.
Nothing like a little good old blackmail to keep you everything moving smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the exercise of this, underground power is the thing that scares me the most. The same thing that, covered up and made sure that we never got a full report of the Mueller report and some of the findings that went along with that. And that kind of power is still evident today.
No doubt, as Cyril Weck said, we like to think that we can't have a coup d'etat, but it is possible. We came very close just a year ago to having that happen. And when you start looking at these things over the broad picture and you start seeing a trend, it is very disconcerting. We can get wrapped up looking at the events of the moment and not see that there really is a power elite that does not want a democratic system. They have been against everyone having the right to vote for a long, long time. And that power structure is asserting itself. And, but all of these things of demonstrating at school boards, of demonstrating against election officials and all of that, this is not an organic grassroots general public uprising. This is a planned, orchestrated, organized effort by very powerful forces. Go ahead, Ralph.
Hey, that was interesting to hear the various witnesses give their accounts of where they heard shots from and where they saw what they thought was maybe a muzzle flash and so on. And one of the things that my father spotted right off the bat was that not all of them were included or addressed in the Warren report, and the ones that were really not ever adequately explained away. There are way too many bullets for which there are evidence, bullets being fired, and but it is amazing that, to me, that anyone actually believes the Warren report. I could see someone believing it at the time, and you wanted to believe it. But the idea that anyone could believe it now is crazy. There was one guy who wrote a book, must be 10 or 12 or 15 years ago now, this guy named Gerald Posner, and he's all out to convince you that it was only Oswald and that all of the rest is BS. And, you know, I read his book, but quickly got, you know, just it not only did it fail to convince me, but he really reaching so many places where he says, well, since we don't have the definitive proof about it, I think we just discount this. Okay, we just discount this. And if we do that, then if you look at all the other things, most of which we've discounted, then there is no conspiracy to kill Kennedy. It's amazing. Somebody as smart as that guy apparently is, college degrees, author, all this stuff, could actually write a book, the only one I know of, by the way, that actually seriously proposes that only Oswald shot President Kennedy. Absolutely amazing. But all you really have to do is look at that compilation of accounts of shots, where the shots were, photographs of shots, the magic bullet rolling out at a stretcher in the hospital, undamaged. I mean, it's astonishing to me that anybody would seriously believe that only Oswald did all this.
Yeah, I suffered through the Posner book. It was one of the more unpleasant experiences of my life, and I kept going back to his footnotes to look at what is his. He had one source,
right?
The Warren Commission report,
right?
That was it.
Right, exactly. He would say things like, yeah, it is alleged that, or others have claimed that, or, and I was thinking, well, then why don't you put that in your bibliography and try to make us believe at least that you read these other skeptical accounts? I didn't see them.
No, that's, you know, and unfortunately, I think his, whatever credibility he might have had, now whatever he would do would be not considered something serious.
No.
So
no.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was painful to read, and there's so many questions that he's just skipping right by or avoiding, and you know,
absolutely. The only thing I ever heard skeptical about the shots that the various witnesses heard is that it is true that it's very hard to tell where shots are coming from, and the acoustics were terrible in there. I mean, you were going to hear something, but as to direction and so forth, it was always going to be a mess.
No, I look, you know, I've been, I've had shots fired at me, and you one of the first things you try to do is to discern where exactly did it come from.
Right.
And it's a source of a lot of confusion.
Right.
But here there are people who are within close proximity to the shot.
Right.
So it's not the echo effect. It is. This was right over my ear. So
yeah, exactly.
I give that some credibility. Yeah.
It does, and if anything, yeah, right back here, this fence behind me,
right,
this picket fence, or this knoll right here, this grassy area, that isn't far away. And if you have to choose between, oh, everyone's mistaken, or there were more shots fired, you have to go with more shots fired. These are credible people, particularly that last fella who was trying to film the thing.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And disturbing.
Hey, Jody.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to talk a little bit about the media, point out the sort of the disparity between reality and illusion, because they played a real role in perhaps creating the concept of Camelot and also perpetuating the concept of Camelot. And so the fact that information has come out many years later about Trafficante and the mob and the Kennedy, perhaps their association with them, it's almost hard to grasp that. I've read it, I believe it. but there was so much illusion created by the press, and we wanted to believe it, that, you know, it's very difficult to piece those two things together, the reality and the illusion that was created.
Yeah, no, if you know, there's been several things written about compare and contrast how the press operated then and how it operates now. Jack Kennedy was as much of a sexual philanderer as Bill Clinton.
Oh yeah.
If not worse.
Much more.
And the press knew about it, but they did not report on it. And you know, there was, remember, a lot of the journalists at the time were World War II journalists. So they had a period where there was great trust between the government and the press. And so you know, that you know, Walter Cronkite and Howard K. Smith and many others who, you know, Huntley Brinkley, these were all people who came from that era. And if the police said, hey, we got the guy, they were inclined to go with it and not to be skeptical. So it's really when Watergate comes that the press really becomes far more challenging, and probably Vietnam War too, but it's really Watergate that really changes that dynamic considerably. Yeah.
Sue?
Yes, I'm wondering what could possibly explain the vast differences between the descriptions and the photos of the injuries. There's such a difference there.
You know, you can't. And what you have is Ramsey Clark becomes the Attorney General, and he just, you know, says, well, the bullet didn't enter at this point. We move it up on the photograph 4 inches. What? I mean, it is such a manipulation of evidence that it's nonsense. All of it is it's just not to be believed.
Was this just to throw off the different theories of what actually happened, where the shots came from?
Well, remember, they were determined to get to case closed. Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to mention about the Posner book. The title of his book is Case Closed. And mind you, again, if I'm the person orchestrating this assassination, what I want to do is I want to quickly get the police and any other law enforcement people, I want to exploit their desire to make an arrest and show that we've got it under control. I want to exploit that. And I know they're under great pressure to do that. So I want to provide them with a suspect and evidence and all of that so they can quickly say case closed.
Except that evidence was so clearly different versions of it. So how does that help that perspective?
Once I got them to say case closed, and everyone is bought into it, FBI, CIA, all of them are rallied around case closed. We got the guy, nothing else to see here. Then it becomes impossible to reopen the case. It's not impossible, but you have to move a mountain to get all those agencies to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe we went too quickly with that conclusion. So you understand, if I'm orchestrating it, I know what the pressure on them will be. And I also know that it's almost impossible for them to ever admit a mistake. So I'm going to take advantage of that, which is why I'm going to work so hard to make sure that they get Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm going to have a description within 15 minutes so they know they know what to go looking for. I'm going to leave breadcrumbs to the weapon so that they find it. And I'm going to have all this stuff already lined up. I'm going to have a photograph of him with the rifle at his boarding house so that when they go and execute a warrant, they're going to find it. I know the receipt I'm going to have the receipt, sitting on a hot cup of coffee so that they'll find it. I'm going to have all of this laid out.
You're so unmuted.
So that they will get it and they can quickly say case closed. You even got the prosecutor out there who hasn't looked at anything. Within hours, he wants to give assurance to the community, we got the guy, we're going to convict him. Now, once I have that set up, I'm just hypothetically, if I was organizing this, I'm going to make sure Lee Harvey Oswald is dead within 72 hours. If I have to drop a nuclear bomb on the Dallas police headquarters or the court, he's going to be a dead person, because I don't want them interviewed. I don't want any real investigation for him to now start saying, well, I went to the theater because my handler called me and told me to go there.
Yeah.
And there was no like we would have now is like Facebook Live or whatever that people are posting to social media immediately so that they couldn't have their pictures taken from them and all that.
So I'm just saying, again, it's hypothetical. Again, if I look at the manual for assassinations and what you do, this is all kind of stuff you would do. And as Colonel Prouty was saying, this ain't new stuff. This is what we do. So it is, and mind you, to me, it is textbook.
Graham, you got another question?
Well, I was one little quick comment was that, my son-in-law is a sniper and they practice what happens after you shoot. Just exactly what you were talking about, Sal. There are tactics that are put in place and that everyone understands ahead of an action. And so I look at this and say that the idea here was not only to get Oswald suspected and then killed, but that was to make sure that every single avenue that went back to the court, that went back to the heavy that's involved at the middle of this is cut off. There's no spider web that leads back to the spider.
Right, exactly. So the idea that, Oswald would have had nothing to do with it. I mean, he would know nothing. So that even if I wasn't able to kill him, that if they somehow put him in a vault and protected him, that, I gotta say, when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, I said to friends, he ain't long for this world.
Yeah, he
had too much information that he could put out. So I mean, so the idea. So people will say, well, wouldn't you have used Oswald to do this, that, or the other thing? No way. He would have nothing. So the reason you don't have fingerprints on his weapon is because he didn't bring it to the building. Somebody else did. And the guy describes the shooter after he then hands the weapon off to someone else who's wearing a railroad uniform. Of course, the shooter ain't going to be carrying that weapon. The shooter ain't going to bring the weapon to the site, and he ain't going to walk away with it. Someone else is going to do that. That's just what you would do. And again, this is all speculation, right? So it's all hypothetical because we don't have evidence, because, as I said in the beginning, my theory is there's not been an investigation. And that the question then is, why not? Somebody had to block that. Some powerful people had to be behind ensuring that there would not be an investigation. And if there was an investigation, all of these avenues, all of these lines of investigation would have been thoroughly examined. Yeah. And the implications for today is that if there were people that powerful then, they didn't get less powerful over the past 60 years. They got more powerful. Until the point where they could put someone in power who would give them a refund.
You always leave us on such a happy note, Sal.
Okay. Any other comments? Observations?
Anyone think that Sal's crazy? I mean, you know. In addition to the class.
In the summary that I'll send you this week, it will be it'll be the summary of the evidence that we've looked at so far that I presented at the end, because it's it's only when you look at that broad accumulation of anomalies that it becomes painfully obvious that the story we're told is Walt Disney and not real. And so, I mean, I have shortly before class started, an old friend called, I don't know if any of you have seen me on the Olympics. I've had a lot of people call because they've seen me on the Olympics.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The NBC is broadcasting the Olympics, and NBC decided it was going to create a commercial for Meals on Wheels Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
And so they did, and Meals on Wheels asked if I would, because I deliver for Meals on Wheels, and they said, would you, participate in this? And and sure, and I know many of the people that we deliver to, and I said, well, we need to go to this person and that person, people who I thought would be, kind of big personalities for this commercial. Well, so I thought it was really going to be, kind of about the people we deliver to, and I would have like a cameo kind of thing. And turns out it's really all about me.
Oh.
It's pretty wild. And so people who have been watching the Olympics, and they go, what the hell? And I'm getting messages. So, it's a commercial break, and I'm going to get my next bottle of beer, and I hear Pete Pasquale. What the hell? I haven't heard from him in 20 years. So I'm getting calls from people that I haven't, because they've seen this commercial.
Right. That's wonderful.
So there's one friend called just before the class, and I said, well, I got to go because I'm doing this class on the Kennedy assassination. And he says, well, what do you think happened? And I've come to realize
3 minutes.
Well, I can't answer that question when people ask me that. Because if you're not going to spend several hours reviewing all of this stuff, whatever I say would simply be denigrated, right? So, I said, well, I really don't know.
So you aren't going to give up teaching and become a movie star, are you?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Oh, Bill Fisher.
Bill, unmute yourself. By the way, that's Sal's little plug to donate to Meals on Wheels.
There you go.
Yeah, let's do that.
Right. Before you get off the computer today.
It strikes me that if you look at the makeup of the Warren Commission, there are only 2 Democrats on the Warren Commission. Richard Russell, who would be conservative by today's standards, very conservative, and Hale Boggs, both of those guys were tightly linked with Lyndon Johnson. And all the others are fairly conservative, even guys like John McCloy, who'd been Kennedy's CIA director, was still a pretty conservative guy. So there are no, who the hell is a guy from California? Paul McCloskey was a representative from California, sort of back in those days. There's nobody, so it's a very conservative Warren Commission. And I don't think there's a person on it that, if they had to hand out jerseys today, would be wearing a blue jersey. And there's at least one suspect on the Warren Commission. Alan Dulles would have been on my suspect list to have been involved in the thing.
Yeah, well, but
the master manipulator himself.
But here's the thing:
Yeah.
Richard Russell thought what the commission was concluding was a bunch of crap. He wanted to file a dissenting report.
Oh, I didn't know that. You don't see, I didn't see any publicity on that.
Yeah,
No
yeah, and they had to, you know, LBJ and others had to kind of pressure him to go along, because he didn't. He thought this is nonsense. He thought the magic bullet was ridiculous, and so yeah, and Hale Boggs had problems with it too. So. You know, you're right. It's a very conservative, you know, I mean, he's, you know, elder statesman and all of that. The biggest problem is, of course, the only one with any investigative background, and not much at that, is Alan Dulles. And who's leading the investigation? Alan Dulles.
Yep.
And in my mind, he's the key suspect.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean, everybody in Washington knows that Kennedy fired Dulles over the Bay of Pigs. This was not a secret. This was a huge embarrassment. And so, yeah, he'd have to be a son. You'd have to question him.
Yeah, I grew up in Kentucky, and John Sherman Cooper always had a reputation there. You may not have agreed with his politics, but he always had a reputation for being a person of integrity. But apparently he did he dissent to this in any?
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Everybody. We'll see you next week.
Right. Bye-bye.
Class. Thanks.
Be safe.
Bye all.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
That was a good one.
Mhm.
Okay, I've got to jump off, everyone. So be safe. See you next week.
Bye.
That fits so
Bye.
well with,
I'm going to end it for everybody.